Hello everyone. This video presents some notable historic events that happened on each day during the month of November. On November 1st, 1893, a small force of British soldiers defeated a much larger force of African warriors at the Battle of Mbezi in the south of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, during the First Matabele War. On November 1st, 1896, a picture showing the unclad or bare breasts of a woman appeared in National Geographic magazine for the first time in the publication's long history. On November 1st, 1911, the first known dropping of a bomb from an airplane in combat took place, ushering in one more way for human beings to kill each other. On November 1st, 1944, the first of what would end up to be thousands of missions by the famous Boeing B-29 Superfortress flew over Tokyo, Japan on a reconnaissance mission, the first Allied aircraft over Tokyo since the 1942 Doolittle Raid. On November 1st, 1951, the U.S. military conducted Operation Buster Jangle, in which U.S. soldiers were exposed to atomic explosions in Nevada so that the effects could be studied. On November 1st, 1968, the Motion Picture Association of America, MPAA, introduced a system of rating motion pictures with a letter rating system to guide audiences in choosing which movies to see, especially insofar as movies they deemed appropriate for child age groups. Finally, on November 1st, Mexicans continue their three-day celebrations known as the Day of the Dead, which begins on October 31st and concludes on November 2nd. On November 2nd, 1898, the day recognized as the birth of cheerleading, University of Minnesota, UM, student Johnny Campbell became the first cheerleader in history, directing fans and cheering on the Golden Gophers football team. On November 2nd, 1900, Dr. Jacob Gould Sherman, 1854 to 1942, president of the First Philippine Commission, stated,
"Should our power by any fatality be withdrawn, the Commission believed that the government of the Philippines would speedily lapse into anarchy, which would excuse, if it did not necessitate, the intervention of other powers and the eventual division of the islands among them. Only through American occupation, therefore, is the idea of a free, self-governing and united Philippine Commonwealth at all conceivable. And the indispensable need from the Filipino point of view of maintaining American sovereignty over the archipelago is recognized by all intelligent Filipinos and even by those insurgents who desire an American protectorate. The latter, it is true, would take the revenues and leave us the responsibilities. Nevertheless, they recognize the indubitable fact that the Filipinos cannot stand alone. Thus, the welfare of the Filipinos coincides with the dictates of national honor in forbidding our abandonment of the archipelago. We cannot form any point of view escape the responsibilities of government which our sovereignty entails, and the Commission is strongly persuaded that the performance of our national duty will prove the greatest blessing to the people of the Philippine Islands."
On November 2nd, 1947, eccentric airplane designer Howard Hughes performed the maiden and only flight of his Spruce Goose, also known as the H-4, the Hercules, the largest fixed-wing aircraft ever built. On November 2nd, 1951, a single platoon of the Royal Canadian Regiment fighting in the Korean War on behalf of the United Nations held off a persistent attack by an entire Chinese battalion. On November 2nd, 1957, the North Texas prairie town of Levelland, population around 10,000 at the time, was the scene of one of the better documented UFO incidents. On November 2nd, 2004, the great-grandnephew of artist Vincent van Gogh, Theo van Gogh, age 47, was brutally murdered by an Islamic terrorist while cycling in Amsterdam. Finally, on November 2nd, 2017, we answered reader requests to tell them about the Russian equivalent of the American military headquarters building known as the Pentagon. On November 3rd, 1783, highwayman John Austin became the last person to be publicly hanged at London's Tyburn Gallows. On November 3rd, 1911, one of the most iconic American companies was founded when Louis Chevrolet teamed up with former General Motors co-founder William Durant to form the Chevrolet Motor Car Company. On November 3rd, 1954, Godzilla, the giant fire-spewing dinosaur-like dragon born of nuclear bomb tests, emerged from the sea and onto the silver screen to ravage Japan. On November 3rd, 1957, before any chimpanzee, any man, any woman, any Russian, any American went into space, the Soviet dog Laika became the first astronaut, cosmonaut in Soviet terms, in history, an indication of just how important dogs are to people. On November 3rd, 2014, America's newest skyscraper opened on the site in New York City of the former World Trade Center Twin Towers that were destroyed in the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Finally, on November 3rd, 2020, the 2020 United States of America U.S. presidential election was the 59th quadrennial U.S. presidential election. On November 4th, 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter found the entrance to Pharaoh Tutankhamun's tomb in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. On November 4th, 1924, the citizens of Wyoming took the historic step of electing the first woman governor of any state in the United States. On November 4th, 1955, Denton True Cy Young died, leaving the earth as the greatest Major League Baseball pitcher in history, so great in fact that the annual award for the best pitcher in each major league is named in his honor. On November 4th, 1962, 69,000 feet above Johnston Atoll in the Pacific Ocean, a nuclear-armed Nike Hercules anti-aircraft missile was detonated in the last atmospheric nuclear test by the United States. On November 4th, 1979, a mob of angry Iranians stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 90 people hostage. On Tuesday, November 4th, 2008, Barack Hussein Obama became the first American of African descent elected president of the United States, or you could call him the first biracial president, since his mother was of white European descent and his father was a black Sub-Saharan African. Finally, on November 4th, 2014, voters in Cleveland, Ohio had the opportunity to vote against one of the more Orwellian aspects of modern society, red light cameras. On November 5th, 1530, the St. Felix flood destroyed the city of Reimersval in the Netherlands and killed over 100,000 people, making it the fifth deadliest flood in human history. On November 5th, 1895, an unlikely candidate from Rochester, New York became the first American to patent an automobile. George Selden was actually an attorney that loved to dabble in his workshop. On November 5, 1943, despite explicit orders from Allied and Axis commanders, 4 bombs from a bomber airplane were dropped on the Vatican. On November 5, 2009, Fort Hood, Texas became the scene of the worst slaughter of U.S. military personnel at an American installation when Major Nidal Malik Hassan, an army psychiatrist of all people, went on a murderous shooting spree that left 13 dead and 32 wounded. On November 5, 2017, with President Donald J. Trump under fire from all sides, we took the opportunity to at least congratulate him on setting a fine example to the youth of America by neither smoking nor drinking alcohol. Tragically, though, on that same day, November 5, 2017, Devin Patrick Kelly of New Braunfels, Texas, went on a shooting rampage at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, killing 26 people and wounding another 20 victims in what was the worst mass shooting in the history of the state of Texas. Yet also on November 5, 2017, U.S. citizen and former NRA shooting instructor Stephen Wilford stopped a mass murder in his tracks when Wilford employed his own AR-15 style rifle to stop a gunman that had just shot and killed 26 people. Crime thriller film fans, who are also fierce, strong, and fearless women, were among the first in Cleveland, Ohio to see The Girl in the Spider's Web, a new dragon tattoo story, on Monday, November 5, 2018, at 7 p.m. at Cinemark in Valley View, Ohio. Finally, on Thursday, November 5, 2020, at 7:30 p.m., for some lucky individuals looking for some needed relief and entertainment after the election, Kim Moss PR hosted a virtual screening of Focus Features' Let Him Go, starring Kevin Costner and Diane Lane. On November 6, 1632, at the Battle of Lutzen during the 30 Years' War, the Swedes won, but their king, Gustavus Adolphus, died in the battle. On November 6, 1789, Pope Pius VI appointed Jesuit priest John Carroll as the first Catholic bishop in the United States, although he had earlier been excommunicated. On November 6, 1935, the Hawker Hurricane, the first modern British fighter plane, made its first flight. On November 6, 1995, owner of the Cleveland Browns, Art Modell, made an announcement that broke the hearts of Cleveland football fans, that he was moving the team to Baltimore. Finally, on November 6, 2017, we followed up our article from November 5, 2017 about presidents of the U.S. and their smoking habits with an answer to a reader query about the status of women vis-a-vis smoking through the years. On November 7, 1492, the same year that Christopher Columbus made his epic voyage to the New World, a large meteor fell in the town of Ensisheim, Alsace, Austria, in what is now France. On November 7, 1775, an announcement known as Dunmore's Proclamation, the first movement to free African Americans from slavery, also known as emancipation, took place when the royal governor of Virginia offered freedom to any slave willing to fight for the British against the colonies in the American Revolution. On November 7, 1907, Jesus Garcia saved the entire town of Nacozari de Garcia, Sonora, by driving a burning train full of dynamite 6 kilometers away before it could explode. On November 7, 1933, Fiorello de LaGuardia was first elected mayor of the city of New York, an office he would hold until December 31, 1945. On November 7, 1980, a supernatural horror film titled The Boogeyman was released to theaters in the United States of America. On November 7, 2000, the U.S. DEA made a drug bust of one of the largest illegal LSD labs in the United States. Finally, on November 7, 2018, movie fans in the United States had only 2 more days to wait for the next movie in the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo cinematic series, this time The Girl in the Spider's Web. On November 8, 1520, the Stockholm bloodbath began, an event which followed the successful invasion of Sweden by Danish forces that resulted in the execution of around 100 people. On November 8, 1837, Mary Lyon founded Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, which later became Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, Massachusetts. On November 8, 1901, people once again proved that human beings are willing to riot over just about anything. This time it happened in Greece and was precipitated by the publication of the Gospel of Matthew in a translation from Latin into the modern Greek vernacular, Demotic Greek. Known as Black Thursday, November 8, 1901, was the climax of the Gospel riots, and 8 of the rioters were killed. On November 8, 1895, German physicist Wilhelm Röntgen discovered what has become known as X-rays. On November 8, 1923, a World War I decorated, disaffected, and discontented German veteran led his Nazi Party followers in an unsuccessful coup against the German Weimar government, an event known to history as the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. The failure of this attempted coup resulted in Adolf Hitler being convicted of treason and sentenced to prison, where he wrote his Nazi Bible, Mein Kampf. On November 8, 1950, early in the Korean War, a U.S. Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, flown by U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Russell Brown, shot down a Soviet-built MiG-15 piloted by a North Korean pilot in the first air-to-air combat between jet planes in aviation history. On November 8, 1973, the severed right ear of John Paul Getty III was delivered to a newspaper with a ransom note demanding $3.2 million in return for the kidnapped heir to the Getty fortune. On November 8, 2016, the 58th quadrennial American presidential election was held. On November 8, 2018, we took a look at the evolution of gambling in the United States, with the ultimate result of the advent of online casino gambling. Finally, on November 8, 2019, a big, really big, war movie about one of the most pivotal battles of World War II hit the big screens across the United States when Midway made its debut. On November 9, 694, the 17th Council of Toledo opened, a third round ordered by Egica, king of the Visigoths in Spain, a council of bishops of the Christian Church. On November 9, 1913, the Great Lakes Storm of 1913, the most destructive natural disaster ever to hit the North American lakes, destroyed 19 ships and killed more than 250 people. On November 9, 1918, in the face of catastrophic defeat after 4 years of debilitating war, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany abdicated his throne and went into exile in the Netherlands. On November 9, 1965, 22-year-old American Roger Allen Laporte, a former Catholic seminarian, sat down calmly, poured gasoline over himself, and burned himself to death in front of the United Nations in New York in a protest of the Vietnam War. On November 9, 1979, the computers that served the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, the American and Canadian Anti-Nuclear Defense Agency, wrongly reported that a massive Soviet nuclear strike was on the way, triggering an alert that nearly caused the U.S. to launch its own massive retaliatory nuclear strike. On November 9, 2016, Donald John Trump, New York real estate mogul and television star, was verified as the winner of the 2016 U.S. presidential election. On November 9, 2018, the new blockbuster science fiction action-adventure film Overlord made its U.S. opening in theaters across the country. Finally, black and white coming-of-age comedy drama fans had the chance to be among the first in Cleveland, Ohio, to see Belfast on Tuesday, November 9, 2021, at 7 p.m. at Cedar Lee Theater in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. On November 10, 1202, despite letters from Pope Innocent III forbidding it and threatening excommunication, Catholic crusaders on the Fourth Crusade began a siege of the Catholic city of Zara, now Zadar, Croatia. On November 10th, 1580, another chapter in the long, sorry story of the troubled relationship between the English and the Irish was written when the English army finished a 3-day siege of Dun and Or, Fort of Gold at Ardnacatney, Ireland, by beheading 600 of the defenders, including members of a papal army contingent, just one of a long history of atrocities committed by both sides. On November 10, 1775, the finest fighting force in the history of the world was born when the United States Marine Corps was established in a Philadelphia tavern by Samuel Nicholas. On November 10, 1793, the government of revolutionary France celebrated the Festival of Reason, as it rejected traditional religion, mostly Catholicism in France, and inserted a philosophy known as the Cult of Reason as the national religion. On November 10, 1865, the long, sad saga of the Camp Sumter prisoner of war camp located in Andersonville, Georgia, finally came to a conclusion of sorts when the camp commandant, Confederate Major Henry Wirz, was hanged for the crimes of conspiracy and murder for his terrible treatment of Union soldiers held captive at the camp, popularly known as Andersonville. On November 10, 1871, Welsh-American journalist Henry Morton Stanley finally met the man he had come so far to see, the missionary Reverend David Livingstone, prompting Stanley to blandly state,
"Dr. Livingston, I presume."
November 10, 1898 marks the beginning of the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, the only instance of a municipal government being overthrown in United States history. Finally, on November 10, 2006, the 231st birthday of the United States Marine Corps, President George W. Bush officially opened the National Museum of the Marine Corps at Quantico, Virginia. On November 11, 1620, while anchored in Provincetown Harbor off Cape Cod, the male passengers of the Mayflower wrote and signed a document known as the Mayflower Compact. On November 11, 1673, General Jan Sobieski of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth successfully used military rockets designed by Kazimierz Siemianowicz in the Second Battle of Khotin in the Ukraine, helping to defeat Ottoman forces. On November 11, 1911, the Midwest region of the United States experienced one of the weirdest weather days in American history when it was hit by the cold wave, the Great Blue Norther. On November 11, 1918, over a century ago, Germany signed an armistice agreement with the Allies in a railroad car in the forest of Compiègne, France, officially ending the fighting of World War I at the 11th hour of the 11th day in the 11th month. But all fighting did not actually end at that exact time, and nor did the war. Finally, on November 11, 1993, a sculpture honoring the women that served in the Vietnam War was dedicated at the site of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. On November 12, 1933, Hugh Gray took the first known photos of the Loch Ness Monster. On November 12, 1944, the Royal Air Force, RAF, used its heavy bomber, the Avro Lancaster, to drop tall boy bombs on the last German battleship, the Tirpitz. On November 12, 1970, the people along the Pacific coast of Oregon found out the answer to the question, how many state highway department employees does it take to blow up a whale? On November 12, 1985, fans of mixed martial arts fighting got an early Christmas present when the little girl that would grow up to become the most famous ring girl in MMA was born. Penelope Lopez Marquez was born, appropriately, in Las Vegas, Nevada, although you would know her better as Ariane Celeste. Finally, on November 12, 1993, Denver, Colorado became the site of the first ever Ultimate Fighting Championship event titled UFC 1, what has become the premier promotion of mixed martial arts fighting. On November 13th, 1002, English King Ethelred II the Unready ordered the killing of all Danes in England, known today as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. On November 13th, 1901, a British lifeboat crew answered the distress flares of a small ship in peril off the coast of Norfolk, England, only to suffer terrible hardships in attempting to launch their lifeboat from shore to go to the sailors in peril. November 12th through 13th, 1970, an Indian Ocean cyclone with winds over 150 miles per hour hit what is now Bangladesh, then East Pakistan, killing more than 3 times the number of people killed in the atom bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. On November 13th, 1974, the real story of the Amityville Horror began when Ronald DeFeo Jr. savagely murdered his entire family in the house featured in the popular horror story. On November 13th, 2013, a painting painted by Francis Bacon in 1969 called 3 Studies of Lucian Freud sold for an incredible $142.4 million, the most ever paid for a painting. On the evening of 13 November 2015, a series of coordinated terrorist attacks occurred in Paris, France, and its northern suburb, Saint-Denis. On November 13, 2017, in the United States, we celebrated the annual chance for unmarried spinsters to catch themselves a husband in the Sadie Hawkins Day Race for Freedom. On Monday, November 13, 2017, at 7 p.m., dark comedic drama fans had their chance to be among the first in Cleveland to see 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri, at Cedar Lee Theater in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. Finally, on November 13, 2019, we celebrated Lucky 13 by telling the history of the card game poker, a game that enjoys widespread popularity and comes in so many forms it would be difficult to explain all the different games. On November 14th, the Orthodox Church celebrates Saint Theodora, who once spanked a man after he talked trash about his own wife. On November 14th, 1851, author Herman Melville published his greatest book, Moby Dick, or The Whale. On November 14, 1889, American female journalist Nellie Bly began her trip around the world in a successful attempt to match the fictional story of Phileas Fogg, who went around the world in 80 days in the 1873 Jules Verne novel by the same title. On November 14, 1941, British Royal Navy aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal sunk after being torpedoed by a German U-boat submarine the day before. On November 14, 1967, physicist Theodore Maiman, an American working for Hughes Research Laboratories, was finally granted a patent for the optical maser, microwave amplification by stimulated emission of radiation, device he called the laser, light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation, once the stuff of science fiction and now an everyday common electronic device. On November 14, 1978, over 40 years ago today, the #1 song in the United States was the disco dance tune MacArthur Park by the Queen of Disco, Donna Summer. On November 14, 2013, Canadian law enforcement struck a major blow against child exploitation when the outcome of Project Spade, a 3-year operation which resulted in the international arrest of 348 criminals and the rescue of 383 exploited children and child sex slaves, was officially made public. On the evening of 13 November 2015, a series of coordinated terrorist attacks occurred in Paris, France, and its northern suburb, Saint-Denis. The attacks consisted of mass shootings, suicide bombings, and hostage-taking, including bombings near the Stade de France in Saint-Denis. The deadliest attack was at the Bataclan Theater, where attackers took hostages and engaged in a standoff with police until it was ended on 14 November 2015. On November 14, 2017, we took the opportunity to review the new film 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, that we had the chance to screen the previous night in a full theater. Finally, and also on Tuesday, November 14th, 2017, superhero fans had their chance to be among the first in Cleveland to see Justice League at 7 p.m. in Valley View, Ohio. November 15th, 1280, Saint Albertus Magnus died after having reportedly built an android and discovered the Philosopher's Stone, but according to the faithful, his body did not deteriorate, and according to Mary Shelley, his writings influenced mad scientist Victor Frankenstein. On November 15, 1914, the pre-National Football League professional football world was saddened by the death of a seasoned pro, center Harry Turner of the Canton Professionals, now there is a catchy name, of the Ohio League. On November 15, 1942, the Heinkel HE-219, often called the U, which is German for eagle owl, made its first flight. On November 15, 1969, the Cold War in the icy waters of the Barents Sea became real when the U.S. submarine USS Gato collided with the Soviet submarine K-19. On November 15, 1971, a history-changing event took place when Intel Corporation released their 4004 microchip processor for sale, allowing the manufacture of small computers. On November 15, 2010, Manchester University Press published a hardcover edition of Andrew Smith's The Ghost Story, 1840 to 1920. On November 15, 2018, we brought to you good news and bad news about screening the latest Harry Potter universe major film, Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald. On November 15, 2019, fans of the 1976 to 1981 television franchise by the same name and the two feature films that continued the storyline, Charlie's Angels 2000 and Charlie's Angels Full Throttle 2003, were treated to the latest iteration of the action-adventure series when that year's version of Charlie's Angels made its debut across the United States. Finally, on Monday, November 15, 2021, biographical drama fans had their chance to be among the first in Cleveland, Ohio, to see King Richard at 7 p.m. at Regal Crocker Park Stadium 16 and IMAX in Westlake, Ohio. On November 16, 1871, the National Rifle Association received its charter from the state of New York, starting a long and distinguished history as a major force in encouraging marksmanship by Americans as preparation for possible military service and promoting the shooting sports. On November 16, 1914, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States officially opened as a series of 12 banks serving 12 Federal Reserve districts, with each bank tasked with implementing the monetary policy of the United States as set forth by the Federal Open Market Committee, all being authorized by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. On November 16, 1938, the psychedelic drug lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, that has since become known as acid, was first synthesized in Basel, Switzerland by scientist Albert Hofmann, a genius not to be confused with 1960s American social radical Abbie Hoffman. Also on November 16, 1938, two young mill workers from Halifax, England, were attacked by an elusive blade-wielding madman who became known as the Halifax Slasher. On November 16, 1974, a radio signal was sent from Earth to the star cluster known as M13 in an attempt to communicate with whatever intelligent life forms may exist in that area of the universe. Finally, on November 16, 2020, as the United States and the rest of the world continued to be ravaged by the COVID-19 pandemic, we looked back to a previous pandemic of enormously greater proportions, the infamous Black Death of bubonic plague that ravaged much of the world in the 14th century. On November 17, 1810, Sweden declared war on its ally, the United Kingdom, to begin the Anglo-Swedish War, although no fighting ever took place and there were no casualties. On November 17, 1858, Denver, Colorado, the town that bills itself as the Mile High City because of its elevation of 5,280 feet above sea level, exactly 1 U.S. mile, was founded. On November 17, 1871, the National Rifle Association, NRA, was first chartered in the state of New York by William Church, the editor of the Army and Navy Journal, and General George Wood Wingate. November 17, 1894, the murderous career of H. H. Holmes, one of the first modern documented serial killers, came to an end when he was arrested in Boston, Massachusetts. On November 17, 1993, the United States House of Representatives passed a resolution establishing the North American Free Trade Agreement, normally referred to as NAFTA, a trade treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico that has generated bitter political debate ever since. On November 17, 2005, the puppy that came to be known as Giant George was born in Arizona, a puppy that would become the tallest living dog in the world, and as far as we know, the tallest dog ever at that time. On November 17, 2017, the DC Comics-inspired superhero action movie Justice League made its nationwide premiere in theaters across the USA. On November 17, 2019, we celebrated another one of those made-up holidays. Actually, all holidays are made-up holidays. National Homemade Bread Day. Finally, on Tuesday, November 17, 2020, a limited number of you had a chance at watching a virtual screening of Sound of Metal at 7:30 p.m. On November 18, 1307, Swiss archer William Tell split an apple into two pieces on his son's head with a well-aimed arrow. Contrary to Pat Robertson's beliefs, on November 18, 1803, Haitians won their independence not with the devil's assistance, but with their victory at the Battle of Vertières, the last major battle of the Haitian Revolution. On November 18, 1963, Bell Telephone introduced a new way to dial a telephone, something referred to as dual-tone multi-frequency DTMF technology, or touch-tone, the trademark name dialing. On November 18, 1982, 5 days after a championship fight for the lightweight 135 pounds crown, Kim Duk-koo of Korea died from a blow given by Ohio boxer Ray Boom Boom Mancini, the defending champ. On November 18, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed into law legislation, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, that made certain drug trafficking offenses punishable by the death penalty, a sharp escalation of the war on drugs. On November 18, 1993, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the North American Free Trade Agreement that had been negotiated by President George H.W. Bush in 1992. On November 18, 2017, we celebrated the annual Apple Cider Day, a national day in the United States and in the United Kingdom. On November 18, 2018, just after the 100th anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I, we looked back over the past almost 62 years to take a look at things we find commonplace today that did not exist when Major Dan was born in January of 1957. On November 18, 2020, Learning history might be a passion for some people, yet some kids and their moms and dads that were homeschooling children during the pandemic find this subject boring and difficult. Finally, on Thursday, November 18, 2021, biographical crime drama fans, here was your chance to be among the first in Cleveland, Ohio to see House of Gucci at 7 p.m. at Silver Spot Cinema Pinecrest in Orange Village, Ohio. On November 19, 1703, one of history's most celebrated prisoners died while still in prison, an unidentified man known to us as the Man in the Iron Mask. On November 19, 1911, the infamous Doom Bar, located at the mouth of the River Camel in Cornwall, England, where it empties into the Celtic Sea, claimed another pair of ships, sinking both. On November 19, 1941, HMAS Sydney and HSK Cormoran sank each other off the coast of Western Australia with the loss of 645 Australians and about 77 German seamen. On November 19, 1990, the pop singing duo Milli Vanilli was stripped of the Grammy Music Award they had been given for Best New Artist. On November 19, 1998, the United States House of Representatives began hearings on the Monica Lewinsky President Bill Clinton sex scandal that would result in Clinton being impeached for lying about the affair. Finally, on November 19, 2004, the National Basketball Association reached perhaps its lowest point in its history when players and fans engaged in a rumble at the Palace of Auburn Hills outside Detroit, Michigan. On November 20th, 1518, Sir Marmaduke Constable, a Tudor-era English courtier and soldier, died in a most unusual way when he drank a glass of water and swallowed the frog that was in the water. On August of 1819, the Nantucket whaling ship Essex set sail on a 2.5-year whaling voyage that on November 20th, 1820, turned into eternity. On November 20th, 1861, certain representatives of some Kentucky counties calling themselves the Confederate Government of Kentucky seceded from the Union of the United States of America. On November 20th, 1917, a combined Allied offensive, British and French, stepped off against the Germans at Cambrai, France. On November 20th, 1980, Texaco, the petroleum and gasoline company with the Red Star logo, accidentally penetrated a salt mine as it drilled an oil well beneath a Louisiana lake, causing the water to drain. On November 20th, 1998, a huge step in the history of space exploration took place when the Zarya segment of the International Space Station, ISS, was launched, the first part of the largest man-made object to orbit the Earth. On Wednesday, November 20th, 2013, the cable network FX aired the second episode of American Horror Story Coven to feature Danny Houston as the X-Man of New Orleans, the nickname given to a never-identified serial killer responsible for at least 8 unsolved murders. Finally, on Monday, November 20th, 2017, biographical comedy drama fans had their chance to be among the first in Cleveland to see The Disaster Artist at 7:30 p.m. at Cedar Lee Theater in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. On November 21st, 164 BC, Judas Maccabeus dedicated the Second Temple in Jerusalem, a restoration of the temple first built by Solomon on Temple Mount in 957 BC. On November 21st, 1916, in the waters of the Aegean Sea near the island of Kea, the British hospital ship HMHS Britannic, the new and improved version of the Titanic, struck a naval mine and sank, becoming the largest vessel sunk during World War I. On November 21st, 1927, the grossly inappropriately named Serene, Colorado, failed to live up to its idyllic name and was witness to a massacre of unarmed coal miners by the Colorado State Militia, an event usually called the Columbine Mine Massacre and alternatively called simply the Columbine Massacre. On November 21st, 1959, music DJ and rock and roll legend Alan Freed was fired by WABC in New York for refusing to sign a statement that he had never taken payola, bribes from record companies to play and promote certain records. On November 21st, 1967, the American commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, made the assertion,
I am absolutely certain that whereas in 1965 the enemy was winning, today he is certainly losing.
Finally, on November 21st, 1986, Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a member of the National Security Council of the Ronald Reagan administration, was busy shredding documents, destroying evidence of criminal activity of the Reagan administration as part of the Iran-Contra affair. The 22nd of November is indelibly etched in the public's mind with the death of John F. Kennedy in 1963, while pirate aficionados everywhere mourn the 1718 loss of one of the most colorful pirates of all time, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. On November 22, 1896, George Washington Gale Ferris Jr., the inventor of the Ferris wheel, died in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania of typhoid fever. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. In the aftermath, Lee Harvey Oswald shot and killed Officer J.D. Tippit, a 39-year-old 11-year veteran of the police department. On November 22, 1986, boxer Mike Tyson won the heavyweight boxing championship at the record young age of 20 years old. On November 22, 1988, one of the most costly of the Cold War high-technology weapons was revealed when the prototype of the Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit stealth bomber was made public. Finally, on November 22, 2021, we took a look at the three major motion pictures based on the 1965 Frank Herbert science fiction novel Dune, along with the television miniseries on the same topic. On this date in 1876, a public cry for justice was answered when W.M. Boss Tweed was turned over to legal authorities in New York City after having been captured in Spain. On November 23, 1889, the Palais Royal Saloon in San Francisco became the home of the first public jukebox, a coin-operated contraption that played records on demand. On November 23, 1948, Lewis Robert Hack Wilson, one of Major League Baseball's greatest hitters and one-time highest-paid player in the National League, died penniless, and no one, not even his own son, would claim the body. On November 23, 1953, a United States Air Force F-89C interceptor fighter jet was scrambled to intercept an unknown radar contact over Lake Michigan. On November 23, 1976, Frenchman Jacques Mayol became the first free diver, no scuba or other source of air, to reach the incredible depth of 100 meters. On November 23, 1992, society took another giant step forward with the introduction of the IBM Simon Personal Communicator, the world's first smartphone. Finally, on November 23, 2009, the Philippines were the scene of a travesty of failed democracy when in the town of Ampatuan in Mindanao, province on Mindanao, 58 people were slaughtered while on their way to formally file for a candidate for governor, including the wife and two sisters of the candidate. Fans of the film Braveheart may recall the heir to England's throne, future King Edward II, having eyes for men rather than his French wife, Isabella the She-Wolf. One of these men, Hugh Despencer, First Lord Despencer, lived circa 1286 to November 24th, 1326, became a victim of that vengeful woman in one of history's all-time most brutal executions, because, as they say, well, sort of,
hell hath no fury like a she-wolf scorned.
On November 24th, 1835, the Texas Provincial Government Permanent Council authorized the creation of a mounted paramilitary police force to enforce laws throughout the Republic of Texas and protect its borders. On November 24th, 1863, Union forces under the command of future President of the United States Ulysses S. Grant captured Lookout Mountain as part of the campaign to relieve the siege of Chattanooga, Tennessee by Confederate General Braxton Bragg. On November 24th, 1971, a man known only as D.B. Cooper jumped with a parachute from a Boeing 727 into history as the only unsolved airplane hijacker. Finally, on November 24th, 2017, we took a second look at the article we published the previous year on this date, Cop Shooting Epidemic, Why Is It Happening? On November 25th, 1120, a ship sailing from Normandy, France to England hit a rock and capsized, quickly sinking and taking everyone aboard, save one, to their deaths. On November 25th, 1864, a group of Confederate Special Forces operatives attempted to burn down New York City by starting fires in a plot orchestrated by Jacob Thompson, Inspector General of the Confederate States Army. On November 25, 1940, the feverish pace of developing improved warplanes during World War II culminated in the first flight of two of the most iconic twin-engine medium bombers of the war, the British de Havilland Mosquito and the American Martin B-26 Marauder. On November 25, 1947, the United States was in the glow of having decisively won World War II and stepping up to become the major economic and military power in the world, the only nation with nuclear bombs. But the Soviet Union, USSR, had built a gigantic military force during World War II and proved to be a problematic ally after the war by scooping up as much territory and installing as many puppet governments as they could. On November 25, 1970, Japanese author Yukio Mishima, a nom de plume, a man with multiple nominations for the Nobel Prize for Literature, attempted a coup d'etat in Japan. On November 25, 2009, almost 3 inches of rain fell in only 4 hours on the western Saudi Arabian city of Jeddah, located on the Red Sea. Finally, on November 25, 2013, in an online article, Claire Sutta discussed academic efforts to study the way women interact with each other, especially with regard to speaking. Okay, so we know Abraham Lincoln created the Thanksgiving holiday on this date in 1863, but what do Wallachians have to be thankful for? Digging deeper, we find Vlad Tepes, later referred to as Vlad the Impaler, known to us more popularly as Dracula, having declared his third reign as ruler of Wallachia, modern Romania, winning the battle that made him ruler for the third time. On November 26, 1883, at the age of 86, Sojourner Truth, perhaps the greatest African-American woman advocate of civil rights, died of natural causes, ending one of, if not the greatest life of fighting for African-American rights. On November 26, 1977, the people of southern Britain were astonished to find their afternoon televisions hijacked by an entity claiming to be Vrillon. Some television viewers reported the entity's name to be Gillon or Asteron. On November 26, 1983, London's Heathrow Airport was the scene of one of the most spectacular heists in crime history, an incident referred to as the Brinks Mat robbery. On November 26, 2015, we ran an article about guns the firearm enthusiast might desperately want for a nice Christmas or Festivus or Kwanzaa or Hanukkah or winter solstice present. So on this holiday, when thoughts of children are wandering to their Christmas and Hanukkah lists, those among us that are hunters, law enforcement officers, military people, recreational or competitive shooters, interested in self-defense and the preservation of liberty, or just into the history and technology of firearms, we presented to you our bucket list of guns we would like to own before we are too old to enjoy them. On November 26, 2018, we once again revisited a subject we have covered twice before. Dear Santa, I Want a Gun for Christmas, and Dear Santa, I Want a Gun for Christmas Redux. Finally, on November 26, 2020, we wished you all a happy Thanksgiving. On November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II announced at the Council of Clermont in Clermont, France, before a mixed council of clergy and laypeople, landholding nobles, a call to arms that would become known as the First Crusade, a Catholic invasion of the Muslim world with the goal of liberating Jerusalem and the holy sites and putting them back in Christian hands. On November 27, 1810, a Londoner named Theodore Hook perpetrated one of the most effective hoaxes in history, throwing a large part of the city into disarray and confusion, all because of a bet and without spending much money at all. On November 27, 1835, 2 Englishmen were hanged for the crime of sodomy, Section 15 Offenses Against the Person Act of 1828, and a third man was convicted of being an accessory, receiving a sentence of 14 years penal transportation. On November 27, 1942, the French Navy, under the direction of Admiral Ofon, scuttled a large part of the French ships and submarines in port at Toulon, France, in order to keep these valuable assets out of the hands of the German Navy, known as the Kriegsmarine. On November 27, 1968, the Kentucky Colonels of the American Basketball Association, the ABA, a major league basketball rival of the National Basketball Association, the NBA, put a woman on the court during a real basketball game, making her the first and so far only woman to play on a men's top professional American sports team. On November 27, 1978, Mayor George Moscone and City Supervisor Harvey Milk were gunned down by an irate former supervisor. On November 27, 2017, we celebrated Cyber Monday, as we have on every Monday after Thanksgiving each year since 2005. Finally, on November 27, 2019, the Eagles of Ashland University, namely the women's basketball team, was resting after another great win the day before against a tough team from Walsh University, with the Eagles prevailing by only 8 points, their lowest winning margin of the 2019 to 2020 season. On November 28, 1893, the women of New Zealand became the first women in the world to vote in a national election. On November 28, 1895, the first American auto race took place, the Chicago Times-Herald race, a 54-mile event with a grand prize of $5,000. On November 28, 1925, a 1-hour barn dance radio show began in Nashville, Tennessee, broadcast on WSM that became known as the Grand Ole Opry. On November 28, 1942, in the middle of World War II, the United States suffered mass carnage on the home front when the infamous Coconut Grove fire took 492 lives. On November 28, 1967, the #1 song in the United States was Daydream Believer by the Monkees, a made-for-television rock band with its own zany television show. On November 28, 2002, Islamic terrorists struck at Israeli targets in Mombasa, a port city on the east coast of Africa in the country of Kenya. Finally, on November 28, 2019, Americans celebrated Thanksgiving, a holiday about being thankful for everything, and it should be celebrated in a good way. On November 29, 800, the Frankish king Charlemagne, aka Charles I, traveled to Rome and the Vatican to investigate charges of adultery and perjury against Pope Leo III, another soap opera in the long saga of the papacy. On November 29, 1729, the Native American Natchez people, who had been living peacefully with their French colonist neighbors in the area of what is now Natchez, Mississippi, rose up and attacked the French, killing 138 men, 56 children, and 35 women at the French Fort Rosalie. On November 29, 1781, the Zong, an English slave ship formerly owned by the Dutch, made infamous, even sickening history when the crew threw 142 African slaves overboard to their deaths because the ship had run low on provisions due to misnavigation. On November 29, 1961, the U.S. space agency NASA launched Mercury Atlas V, the first mission to send an American into orbit around the Earth in space. On November 29, 1963, in the wake of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, President Lyndon B. Johnson formed a committee under the direction of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Earl Warren, to investigate the assassination and related events. On the happier side of history, the November 29, 1972 release of Atari's video game Pong spawned a whole new genre of entertainment. On November 29, 1987, Korean Airlines Flight 858 exploded over the Andaman Sea, downing the jetliner and killing all 115 people aboard the plane, mostly people from South Korea. Finally, on November 29, 2009, career criminal Maurice Clemens killed 4 Lakewood, Washington police officers with shots to the head while they were sitting in a coffee shop. On November 30th, 1016, Edmund Ironside, also known as Edmund II or even Edmund Isonside in Old English, was murdered on his throne, stabbed to death as he attended to business. On November 30th, 1718, while manning a front-line trench in a battle in Norway, the King of Sweden, Charles XII, was killed by either a musket ball or a grape-shot ball right through his head. On November 30th, 1786, Grand Duke Pietro Leopoldo I of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany initiated the first ban on capital punishment of any modern state. On November 30th, 1864, Confederate Lieutenant General John Bell Hood set what has to be a record for an American general for getting his subordinate generals killed and wounded after ordering an epic failed charge against Union forces led by Major General John M. Schofield at the Battle of Franklin in Tennessee during the American Civil War. On November 30th, 1939, Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border in several places and bombed Helsinki and several other Finnish cities, starting the Winter War. On November 30th, 1954, an incredibly unlikely and rare instance of an object from space striking a living human in the United States occurred, perhaps the only verified occurrence in American history when a grapefruit-sized meteorite slammed through the roof of an Alabama house and struck a woman sleeping on her couch. On November 30th, 1982, Michael Jackson, known as the King of Pop for good reason, released his 6th solo album, the monster hit Thriller. On November 30th, 2001, a depraved serial killer known as the Green River Killer was finally arrested. Finally, on November 30th, 2005, John Sentamu was given the title 97th Archbishop of York, making him the first black of sub-Saharan African origin Archbishop in the Church of England. As a question for my students and subscribers, which historic event that happened in November would you like to learn more about? Please let me know in the comments section below this video. To learn more about each of the events mentioned in today's video, please visit the calendar on our website. If you liked this video and would like to receive notification of new videos, please feel welcome to subscribe to History and Headlines and become one of our patrons. Your viewership is much appreciated.